It takes two to make a cave go right. It's NES Works episode 89.
As they prefer to be known, trekkers.
The primary theme throughout the NES 1988 library has been multiplayer, games best enjoyed by two people playing side by side. The trend reaches its inevitable pinnacle here with Bubble Bobble, a game that can only be enjoyed by two people playing side by side. Or rather, that can only be completed properly by two people. Bubble Bobble is perfectly amusing on its own, but the game contains a diabolical ghosts and goblins-like twist. Simply completing the game does not yield its true ending. No, in order to fully defeat Bubble Bobble, you need to join together with another person and destroy Super Drunk with the power of friendship. Or at least the power of convenient, pragmatic allyship. This seems like a natural progression for NES software. Games based around simultaneous cooperative play appeared a few times throughout the NES's first few years of life. Ice Climber and Mario Brothers in the earliest days, followed by IKARI Warriors and Stinger in 1987. But 1988 kicked off with Contra and never really looked back. Even as single-player games embrace increasingly deep mechanics and grand narrative ambitions, the other primary thread woven throughout the NES tapestry demands people team up to take on the system's virtual threats. I assume that this newfound spirit of cooperation comes to us not necessarily due to a sudden shift in the temperament of game developers, who had treated the medium as a social experience since the beginning, but rather due to technological improvements. The move from standard NES ROMs to more advanced UN ROM and MMC1 chips didn't simply allow NES games to become larger thanks to those chips' increased storage capacity. Those chips also included co-processing functions that helped the hardware produce more impressive output, such as multidirectional scrolling and extra background functions. It's not so much that the NES couldn't have handled simultaneous play from the start. Mario Bros. Shipped in Japan a couple of months after the Famicom hardware, after all, as it is that these new cartridge features allowed developers to integrate simultaneous play without having to make so many other technical compromises. I mean, Mario Bros. Was pretty rough, struggling to handle a few characters at a time. Bubble Bobble debuted in Japan on the Famicom Disk System, which offered a number of enhancements over the stock Famicom hardware. And Taito followed Nintendo's lead in porting it to NES. As with Zelda and Metroid, Bubble Bobble ran on the advanced MMC1 chip in its cartridge incarnation. Sure, Bubble Bobble may look rudimentary with its blocky platforms against a solid black background, but it throws a ridiculous amount of stuff around the screen at once. Between the two-player avatars, the chunky dino friends Bub and Bob, the many enemies that can appear in a stage, the numerous bubbles that you can spew at a time, the various power-ups and icons that show up during play, and dynamic elements like water currents, there's a lot going on here, and it really demonstrates how far the NES had come since its debut. Of course, we've already seen Bubble Bobble on Game Boy, but this is the version most people remember. Arcade machines that saw middling success in their coin-op releases had a tendency to come into their own on NES, and that appears to have been the case for Bubble Bobble. Maybe it was a matter of economics. A two-player session of Bubble Bobble demanded a 50-cent investment for 3 lives apiece, which was fairly steep for an arcade game in the mid-80s. But drop a single payment of $34.99 for the NES game, and you could take Bubble Bobble home with you forever to play as many times as you liked. Besides, a complete playthrough of Bubble Bobble spanned 100 stages, and then some, which is a long time for two people to stand in an arcade cabinet, quarter sync notwithstanding. But for two siblings or friends who needed to kill time on a lazy, rainy weekend afternoon hanging out in front of the family TV for a couple of hours was pretty much standard tween behavior in 1988. And Taito put together a strong adaptation of the arcade game for NES. Bubble Bobble doesn't appear as a perfect home port, of course, but it does the trick. In addition to suffering from some modest graphical downgrades, this port loses some notable arcade features. The bonus levels that appeared occasionally as rewards for excellent play failed to make their way to NES, and several stages featured new layouts. Unavoidably, the persistent elements of the arcade had to be greatly simplified on NES. The coin-op machine included secret counters that tracked the actions that all players took across play sessions, activating certain bonuses or other elements based on actions previous players had taken in earlier sessions. Obviously, that couldn't have happened on NES, or at least not on a cartridge that lacked a battery-based save, so Bubble Bobble loses a touch of its unpredictability on NES. and it doesn't hide any secrets behind the strange ciphertext of the arcade's bonus rooms. To its credit though, the NES game does add 13 all-new stages that comprise the best ending. And this is why you need to play Bubble Bobble with a second person. The game doesn't allow you to access those additional stages if you go it alone. Outside of these additions and seemingly unavoidable exclusions though, Bubble Bobble on NES does an impressive job of reproducing its arcade forebear. It quite effectively ports the coin-op's deceptively simple gameplay to console, almost but not quite, perfectly integrating the subtle techniques Taito built into its design. Yes, you and a friend play as tubby dinosaurs, whose only abilities consist of jumping and spitting bubbles. How about the things you can do with those spit bubbles? Spit a bubble at one of the monsters that roams the maze, including monsters, those purple guys who first showed up dropping from eggs and Chack and Pop, and you'll trap it. Tap a bubble encasing a foe and you'll burst it, transforming the monster within into a collectible icon, usually some sort of gem or snack food. You can gather these to earn points. Capture and destroy all the monsters in a stage, and you move along to the next. Lather, rinse, and repeat. Were this the entirety of Bubble Bobble's play loop, it would have gone down in history as a mildly amusing but ultimately insignificant creation. There's certainly some value in the simple existence of multiplayer design, thus the fact that NES games like Ice Climber, IKARI Warriors, and Urban Champion continue to have fans to this day. Sharing a game experience with another person goes a long way toward making up for that game's inherent shortcomings. Yet Bubble Bobble transcends being some mediocre dud, subsisting on the appeal of its collaborative element. The particulars of its gameplay lend themselves to practice and often demand genuine teamwork. But when Bob's membranous projectiles do more than simply capture monsters and monsters, they also function as objects. Although fragile, the bubbles you blast have physical presence in the game, volume if not mass. You can use them as platforms, and you can manipulate their physics in order to push objects around, generally other bubbles. As other mechanics come into play, such as the torrential floods of water that blast through the stages, or the ability to zap enemies with electricity that flies across the screen, the action demands considerably more nuanced technique than you might expect from such a simple-looking work. Before too long, you'll encounter stages that practically demand teamwork to complete. Some spaces seem insurmountable unless two people who fully understand the peculiarities of the bubble physics collaborate in tandem to climb wells or escape what appear to be pits. A single player can get through some of these obstacles on their own, but playing solo comes with greater risk. It's possible to become stuck in a space and be forced to wait until some enemy, probably the invincible Skelemonster that appears to prevent you from dallying too long in a single level, manages to kill you and reset your position when you respawn. You may not want to squander your life like that though. Although Bubble Bobble allows you to continue as often as you need, using a continue resets your score. And from what I can tell, score serves a similar, albeit simplified function here to what it does in the arcade version of the game. Special items appear around the screen at fixed intervals as you play, usually 2 per stage. Your current score often determines the nature of those items, meaning more powerful items are more likely to appear as your score increases. Then again, some items appear based on actions, such as the number of bubbles blown, similar to the arcade game's mechanics, minus the cross-session persistence. So there's value to continue in as well. The arcade game allowed you to warp ahead 20 stages if you made it to level 50 without dying, but that's not possible here, so what the heck, let the charnel begin. Unlike the other Taito releases we've seen on NES Works and NES Works Gaiden, Bubble Bobble does not appear to have been developed externally by a contractor like Tosei or Micronix. By all accounts, Taito programmed this version internally, which could account for its fidelity to the arcade game. Certainly it comes a lot closer to reproducing its source material than its spiritual predecessor Chack and Pop did. Bubble Bobble stood at the vanguard of a newly reinvigorated Taito that attacked the mid-80s with appealing innovative games, which felt like worthy heirs to the legacy of Space Invaders and elevator action. Between Darius, Razdan's Saga, Ninja Warriors, and Bubble Bobble, Taito caught its second wind here. The sleeper hit popularity of Bubble Bobble in particular surely played a part in the company's decision to split its development efforts between arcades and consoles going forward. And if not, well, at least it was responsible for the most addicting video game earworm ever composed, taking up residence in our collective brain. Next up, JACKAL commits themselves fully to the sports game racket. Get it? It's a tennis game. Racket Attack. Remember Bases Loaded? That game may have earned itself a reputation as buggy shovelware in Japan, but it sold more than 1 million copies before players cottoned to its shortcomings. And that encouraged JACKAL to turn that one game into a sports empire. You can definitely tell JACKAL created Racket Attack as a successor to Bases Loaded. I don't mean that in a loose, these are sports games by the same company sense. In Japan, Racket Attack shipped under the name Moero Tennis, firmly establishing it as part of the same label that gave us Moero Pro Yakyu. The US title doesn't draw quite so direct a line between the two releases, but there's no mistaking the similarities in the packaging, which sports bold red text on a white box emblazoned with a detailed yet slightly impressionistic painting of folks playing tennis. It also includes a prominent logo for sports manufacturer Wilson, who establishes a new precedent for the NES, a third-party sponsorship. This has no impact on the game itself, but external sponsorships would become a fairly common occurrence on NES that sometimes overshadowed the actual contents of the games in question. For Racket Attack, however, the sport dominates front and center. This is, perhaps surprisingly, the first tennis game to show up on NES since launch. If you thought Mario Bros. And Bubble Bobble made for a striking side-by-side demonstration of NES software evolution over the course of 3 years, Racket Attack almost seems to be on a different console altogether from Nintendo's tennis. Make no mistake, tennis was great for its time, a real milestone in the evolution of this virtual genre. JACKAL and developer, you guessed it, Tosei, built Racket Attack in the image of that 1984 game, but improved on it in every respect. Well, almost every respect. Like Nintendo's game, Racket Attack limited its two-player mode to cooperative doubles play. There's no competitive play here, just like back in the black box days. Otherwise though, Racket Attack plays like tennis dialed up to at least a 9, maybe a 9.5. Players can select their avatar from 12 different digital athletes, all of whom very clearly reference famous pro players despite not technically licensing names or likenesses. I'm a total tennis bozo, but I can still recognize the very obvious, let's say, homages to John McEnroe and Billie Jean King. Oh right, those 12 playable characters include an even mix of men and women, offering a much wider range of personal representation than previous tennis games. Or at least, a greater likelihood of being able to play as not technically your favorite sports star. Your choice of gender does appear to have an impact on play. It's in my experience, the men move a little more slowly but tend to hit harder than the women, which works as a de facto difficulty selection. Each player comes with distinct strengths and weaknesses, such as speed, accuracy, or net defense. Although Racket Attack doesn't have a proper career mode, it does provide passwords that track your win-loss record. Racket Attack improves just as dramatically on tennis's graphics. You can play on several different courts, each rendered with a unique appearance that hints at the effect the various surfaces have on play. The players look much more realistic, while still retaining some of the exaggerated visual cues that improve tennis's moment-to-moment play, most notably the dramatic shadow and scaling effect on the ball, which communicates its relationship to the court surface and net. Speaking of drama, that's the one thing that most clearly ties Racket Attack to Bases Loaded. JACKAL made an impact on the baseball genre by bringing the television-like camera viewpoint of Accolade's hardball to consoles, and Racket Attack does its best to carry forward that spirit here. Where Bases Loaded gave players an in-close viewpoint of the pitcher's perspective, Racket Attack applies a similar treatment to tennis, namely putting players into the thick of things during service. The camera begins each match low to the ground, framing the athlete or athletes in the backcourt behind the net as you fire off your initial service. Once you've set the match into motion, the camera quickly shifts to a more standard tennis perspective, a high angle that still skews the lines of the court toward a distant vanishing point. Unlike in other 8-bit tennis adaptations we've seen to this point, however, Racket Attack's court spans more than a single screen. The camera can pan a short distance in all directions during a match, allowing you more space to maneuver, but also requiring you to defend more territory. It's technically impressive, another feat made possible by the mighty MMC1 chip, but I'm not convinced it necessarily makes for a better game. The virtual camera loves the ball a little too much, fixes the ball dead center in the viewpoint at all times, including every time it bounces off the court. This makes for a somewhat barfy game experience, the work of sadists with a love for inducing motion sickness upon the masses. Along with the camera motion, the game's more naturalistic player movement also helps to make Racket Attack a more difficult game to master than previous 8-bit tennis sims. As your on-screen avatar runs around, their mass and inertia affect the precision of their responses to your commands. You need to account for the slight delay as a player moves into action from a standstill, or reverses the direction of their run. Combined with the very active way the camera tracks, you'll need to take time to master your character's relationship with the ball, which is not a bad thing, but definitely one that requires some mental recalibration. If you have the stomach for it though, Racket Attack was by far the best interpretation of the sport yet produced for 8-bit consoles to this point, and it holds up reasonably well many years later. It offers pick-up and play simplicity, but also contains enough play options, men and women, 3 kinds of court, solo and best of 3 or 5 matches, to sustain longer sessions. All in all, an impressive release in Japan and the US, but maybe less so in Europe, where this game inexplicably shipped all the way in 1994 as one of the very final continental releases for NES. There's a time and a place for everything, and Racket Attack's time and place was 1988, not 94.
Love.
Next time on NES Works, a philosophical meditation on the futility of international ideological conflict.